Ah, yes. Here we are again. Join me as I unlock the mysteries of complete boredom, complete dullness, of absolutely having nothing better to do but read ancient writings and about them. A journey of the mind, deep into the recesses of I don't know. Hmm. I think I might read philosophy. Idea of philosophy. Let me update the title. It's funny how half the people in the world just live on the internet now, and the other half are like, where is everybody? What happened to half the world? Don't worry about it, loser. That's what it seems like. Myself included. But then again, I was never all that social in the first place. So it kind of suits me. Nobody bothers you if they don't know where to find you. All right. I can read my books in peace. One of the best you can hope for. Philosophy. 342. How long is this one? I like reading this stuff though, even though it's the weekend. Still gonna do it because it's good for my mind. Good for my state of mental health. Seems like. Which is always the verge of total collapse. Chapter 66, Philosophy. Introduction. The difficulties which attend the... I forgot to breathe. The difficulties which attend the consideration of any great idea by philosophers or others appear with peculiar force in the traditional discussion of philosophy itself. The word philosophy not only varies in its descriptive significance, now designating one part of learning, now another, and sometimes even an attitude of mind or a way of life, but it also varies as a term of evaluation. It is seldom used without expressing either praise or dispraise of the methods and accomplishments of philosophy, or of the calling and character of the philosopher. On the descriptive side, the meaning of the word ranges from a conception of philosophy which covers all branches of scientific knowledge and which contrasts philosophy with poetry, history, and religion, to a conception of philosophy in which the primary point is its contrast to science and its association with poetry and religion as works of vision, speculation, or belief rather than of knowledge. On its evaluative side, the word philosophy sometimes eulogizes the love and search for truth, the pursuit and even the attainment of wisdom. At the other extreme, it derogates vain learning, idle disputation, and the dogmatism of unsupported opinion. At one time, the good name of the philosopher stands in contrast to the questionable reputation of the sophist. At another, philosopher carries almost the same invidious connotation as sophist. The dismissal of philosophy as useless, or at best ornamental, in the practical affairs of society is sharply opposed to the vision of an ideal state, which can come to pass only if philosophers are kings or kings' philosophers. These shifts in the meaning of the words philosophy and philosopher record crises in the history of Western thought. They reflect the characteristic formations of our culture in its major epochs. The great books of antiquity, for example, seem to give no intimation of a division between science and philosophy. Particular bodies of knowledge, such as physics or mathematics, are indifferently regarded as sciences or branches of philosophy. The crown of knowledge is wisdom, approached as one rises in the hierarchy of knowledge to the highest science or the first philosophy. Aristotle and Plato may disagree in naming or defining the type of knowledge which deserves to be called wisdom, yet for both it is the ultimate attainment of philosophical inquiry or scientific work. The differences between Plato and Aristotle, discussed in the chapters on dialectic and metaphysics, the one using dialectic as the name for the supreme form of knowledge, the other using theology to name the summit of the sciences, do not affect their agreement that the philosopher is a man of knowledge, not opinion, and that his ultimate goal is wisdom. If there is any distinction in antiquity between science and philosophy, it seems to find expression in the sense in which Socrates speaks of philosophy as the love of wisdom, implying thereby its pursuit rather than its attainment. A man would not be called a scientist in a particular field, mathematics, let us say, unless he actually had some mathematical knowledge. But a man who is not actually wise can be called a philosopher by virtue of his effort to become wise. Apart from this point of distinction, the Greeks tend to identify philosophy with the fundamental sciences, which somehow yield speculative or practical wisdom. Considering the whole of human learning, all its arts and disciplines, we see that the things the ancients distinguish from philosophy are poetry, history, and the particular productive arts or crafts. Here again, Plato and Aristotle do not make the distinction in the same terms. Plato compares the poet unfavorably with the philosopher in the Republic. The poet is an imitator of imitations and moves on the level of images and beliefs, whereas the philosopher rises above the imagination to the level of ideas, which are the only true objects of knowledge. Aristotle, on the other hand, seems to pay poetry a compliment when, in the Poetics, he says that it is more philosophical than history because it deals with the universal rather than the particular. These attitudes toward poetry in relation to philosophy are somewhat reversed by the fact that for Plato, myth and poetry provide materials from which philosophical insights can sometimes be distilled, whereas for Aristotle, sense experience is the source from which, by induction, the principles or axioms of philosophical knowledge are obtained. Despite these differences, their accord on the supremacy of the philosopher remains unaffected. More than poetry and history, all the knowledge that can be applied productively, philosophy represents the highest use of man's faculties. On this, Aristotle and Plato seem to be agreed, even though Aristotle distinguishes the philosophical from the political life and assigns the most perfect happiness to the contemplative activity of the philosopher, whereas Plato, in the Republic at least, brings the philosopher back to the shadows of the cave after he has seen the light of truth itself, so that he can put his wisdom to practice in the government of his less fortunate fellow man. The practice of philosophy seems to become, for the Roman writers, more important than the content of philosophy as a body of doctrine. What is that which is able to conduct a man? Asks Marcus Aurelius. one thing and only one philosophy. It keeps the inner man free from violence and unharmed, superior to pains and pleasures, doing nothing without a purpose. It enables him to accept all that happens and all that is allotted, and finally, to wait for death with a cheerful mind, as being nothing else than a dissolution of the elements of which every living being is compounded. To Aurelius, his imperial court is like a stepmother to whom one must be dutiful, philosophy like a mother from whom one gains solace and help. Return to philosophy frequently, and repose in her, he tells himself, so that what thou meetest with in the court appears to thee tolerable, and thou tolerable in the court. The Stoic conception of philosophy as a moral discipline The Stoic conception of philosophy as a moral discipline and as a consolation creates the sense of the word in which the familiar injunction to a person in distress, be philosophical, carries the same meaning as be stoical. Never really heard that. Philosophy provides only peace of mind, not worldly riches or external power. Philosophy does not promise to secure to man anything outside himself, says Epictetus. Nor does it fulfill its promise of inner strength without stern resolution to withdraw desire from the goods of fortune. Do you suppose that you can be a philosopher if you do as you do now? Epictetus asks. Do you suppose that you can eat and drink as you do now, and indulge your anger and displeasure just as before? No, you must sit up late. You must work hard, conquer some of your desires. When you have carefully considered these drawbacks, then come to us. If you are willing to pay this price for peace of mind, freedom, tranquility, do not try to be, quote, first a philosopher, then a tax collector, then an orator, then one of Caesar's procurators. These callings do not agree. You must be busy either with your inner man or with things outside. That is, you must choose between the position of a philosopher and that of an ordinary man. There seems to be no difference between the Stoic and Epicurean conception of philosophy. Lucretius praises Epicurus, thanks to whom sweet solaces of life soothe the mind. For as soon as his philosophy, quote, begins to proclaim aloud the nature of things, the terrors of the mind fly away. But for Lucretius, philosophy achieves this boon not merely by curbing the passions and quieting desires, but also and primarily by the truth of its teachings about the constitution of the world. And the causes of things. Nor is it merely that the philosophical mind is able quote, to dwell in the calm high places, firmly embattled on the heights by the teaching of the wise, whence you can look down on others and see. I already read this quote. Them wandering hither and thither, going astray as they seek the way of life. In the chapter on wisdom, I guess. Men fear as they seek the way of life. Philosophy provides a more specific remedy for the deepest of human ills by, quote, freeing the mind from the close bondage of religion. Men fear the thunderbolts of the gods, their intervention in the course of nature and human affairs, and the punishments of the afterlife. Before Epicurus taught them the mortality of the soul and the atomic determination of all things, the life of man lay foul to see and the life of man lay foul to see and groveling upon the earth, crushed by the weight of religion. His teaching concerning what can come to be and what cannot, and in what way each thing has its power limited, rids the mind of the terrors fostered by religion. This, quote, darkness of mind must needs be scattered by the outer view and inner law of nature. Except for Lucretius, the triumph of philosophy over religion does not seem to be central to ancient conceptions of philosophy's contribution to the mind and life of man. In the pagan world, religious belief is either combined with philosophy to constitute the worship of the gods, which seems to be Plato's view in the Laws, or it represents the superstitions of the ignorant as opposed to the sophistication of the educated. Gibbon describes the rift between religion and philosophy not as a matter of intellectual controversy, but as a division of society into classes lacking or having the benefits of education, or what is the same in the ancient world, instruction in philosophy. But in the medieval world, the distinction between philosophy and religion seems to be essential to the consideration of the nature and value of philosophy. But in the medieval world, the distinction between philosophy and religion seems to be essential. The consideration of the nature and value. The importance of the distinction appears alike in the great books of the Christian tradition. And in the great writings of the Mohammedan and Jewish cultures. In Augustine and Aquinas, Avicenna, Averroes, and Maimonides, though the problem of philosophy's relation to religion and theology may be quite differently solved by each. In all three religious communities, secular learning and sacred doctrine are set apart by their origin, the one from the efforts of human reason, the other from the Word of God as revealed to the faithful, even when it is held in highest esteem as the best achievement of secular learning. Philosophy is for the most part regarded as inferior to the teachings of religion. There are those, the simply religious, the devout, the mystical, who abominate the pretensions of reason and the vanity of philosophers, who claim either merit or need for any knowledge beyond the truths which God himself has revealed. This position is expressed by such Christian writers as Tertullian, Peter Damian, Bernard of Clairvaux, or in the Arabic tradition by Al-Ghazali, The Destruction of Philosophy. Al-Ghazali is answered by Averroes in his Destruction of the Destruction, which asserts the supremacy of philosophy. Averroes reveres philosophy for men of requisite intellectual strength and relegates theology and religion to those who must substitute opinion and imagination for reason. Neither Augustine nor Aquinas goes to these extremes. They do not dismiss philosophy as useless learning or as dangerous folly, subversive of the wisdom of faith, but neither do they admit the sufficiency of philosophy for knowledge of God, the mysteries of the divine nature, God's providence and his gracious gift of salvation to man. Quoting St. Paul's warning to beware lest any man spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit, according to the tradition of men and the rudiments of the world, and not according to Christ. Augustine defends his praise of the Platonic philosophy, which in his judgment comes nearest to the Christian faith, on the ground that the apostle also said to the Gentiles that which is known of God is manifest among them, for God has manifested it to them. Yet he adds that, quote, the Christian man who is ignorant of their writings is not therefore ignorant that it is from the one true and supremely good God that we have that nature in which we are made in the image of God, and that doctrine by which we know him and ourselves, and that grace with which, by cleaving to him, we are blessed. Philosophy, according to Augustine, can thus be dispensed with in all the major concerns of knowledge, love, or action. But Augustine does not argue that it should therefore be discarded. If those who are called philosophers, he says, and especially the Platonists, have said aught that is true and in harmony with our faith, we are not only to shrink from it, but to claim it for our own use from those who have unlawful possession of it, even as the spoils of the Egyptians belong to the Jews. Though Augustine and Aquinas conceive the relation of faith and reason differently, they seem to share a conception of philosophy as the handmaiden of theology, when faith seeks understanding. For Aquinas, this does not appear to imply lack of dignity or even the loss of a certain autonomy on the part of philosophy. On the contrary, so highly does he regard the demonstrations of Aristotle, whom he calls the philosopher, that he opens the Summa Theologica with the question whether, besides the philosophical sciences, any further doctrine is required. He answers that besides the philosophical, he opens the Summa Theologica with the question. So he's saying, I guess for understanding that philosophical sciences are essential. He answers that, quote, it was necessary for the salvation of man that certain truths which exceed human reason should be made known to him by divine revelation. Even as regards those truths about God, which human reason can investigate, it was necessary that man be taught by a divine revelation. For the truth about God, such as reason can know it, would only be known by a few, and that after a long time, and with the admixture of many errors, whereas man's whole salvation, which is in God, depends upon the knowledge of this truth. It was therefore necessary that, besides the philosophical sciences investigated by reason, there should be a sacred science by way of revelation. That sacred science is theology. Not the theology which is a part of philosophy, but the theology whose principles come from faith rather than from reason. There is no reason, Aquinas writes, why those things which are treated by the philosophical sciences, so far as they can be known by the light of natural reason, may not also be treated by another science, so far as they are known by the light of the divine revelation. On this view, sacred theology may treat of certain things, such as the mystery of the Trinity, which do not belong properly to the philosopher, because they exceed the power of reason to demonstrate. But other matters concerning nature, man, and God may belong both to the philosopher and to the theologian, who consider them according to their different lights. Since a truth cannot conflict with a truth, though reason sponsors one and faith the other, there can be no conflict between philosophy and theology. Some modern philosophers, like Bacon and Locke, seem to agree with medieval theologians about the subordination of philosophy to theology. But for the most part, the modern tendency, increasingly evident in the writings of Descartes, Spinoza, Kant, and Hegel, is to insist upon the complete autonomy of philosophy. Hegel, for example, challenges the imputation against philosophy of being shy of noticing religious truths, or of having occasion to be so, and the insinuated, quote, suspicion that it has anything but a clear conscience is the presence of these truths. That and the insinuated, quote, suspicion that it has anything but a clear conscience in the presence of these truths. So far from being the case, Hegel remarks, the fact is that in recent times philosophy has been obliged to defend the domain of religion against the attacks of several theological systems. The diverse aspects of the problem of the relation of philosophy to theology and of theology to faith are discussed in the chapters on metaphysics, theology, and religion. The problem, which is more characteristic of the modern consideration of philosophy, concerns its relation to science. To state the problem, some distinction between the two is necessary, and making this distinction represents a novel departure both in thought and language. As we have seen, philosophy and science are almost identified throughout the ancient and medieval tradition. Insofar as the word science means knowledge rather than opinion, the result of philosophical inquiry is science, and philosophy as a whole is divided into a number of sciences. There may be, as ancient writings seem to suggest, sciences which aim at useful productions rather than at speculative or practical wisdom, and fall below the level of philosophy. Or there may be, as some Christian theologians hold, a sacred science superior in its wisdom to all the philosophical sciences. But these exceptions to the identity of philosophy and science merely confirm the point that in the ancient or medieval view, philosophy is scientific and consists of sciences, even though there may be sciences which are not philosophical. This use of the words science and philosophy persists well into modern times. Hobbes, for example, presents his classification of the types of knowledge under the heading science, that is, knowledge of consequences, which is also called philosophy. Bacon proposes to divide sciences into theology and philosophy. Descartes uses the word science and philosophy interchangeably. Among the different branches of philosophy, he says, I had in my younger days, to a certain extent, studied logic, and in those of mathematics, geometrical analysis, and algebra, three arts or sciences which seem as though they ought to contribute to the design I had in view. In the prefatory letter to the Principles of Philosophy, he likens philosophy as a whole to a tree whose roots are metaphysics, whose trunk is physics, and whose branches, which issue from this trunk, are all the other sciences. These reduce themselves to three principal ones, viz., medicine, mechanics, and morals. Even as near the end of the 18th century as Hume, the word philosophy continues to be the general name for the particular sciences. It covers the experimental study of natural phenomena, as well as what are for Hume the non-experimental sciences of mathematics and philosophy. But it excludes divinity or theology insofar as its best and most solid foundation is faith and divine revelation. Metaphysics, which is nothing but sophistry and illusion, and all inquiries into particular as opposed to general facts, such as history, chronology, geography, and astronomy. Nor is this use of terms confined to what readers today would call books of philosophy. The authors of the books, which are today regarded as among the foundations of modern science, Galileo, Newton, Huygens, and in the 18th century, Lavoisier and Fourier, refer to themselves as philosophers and to the science in which they are engaged, e.g., mathematics, mechanics, physics, chemistry, as parts or aspects of natural philosophy. They do, however, indicate an awareness of how they differ from ancient and medieval scientists, who also called themselves philosophers by calling their own work experimental philosophy. In this phrase lies the root of the distinction between philosophy and science, as that distinction is generally understood by writers since the 18th century. The word experimental, applied to philosophy, signifies a radical difference in the method of inquiry, and even in the objects to be investigated. For certain objects can be known only by experimental or empirical research. Kant appears to be the first. In the great books, at least, to make a sharp separation between the investigation of either nature or mind by what he calls empirical, as opposed to rational methods. He still uses the name science for both sorts of investigation, but he appears to restrict philosophy to the latter, the pure, the a priori, the rational sciences. Two other innovations must be noted. Though Kant regards it as a rational discipline, he excludes mathematics entirely from philosophy and criticizes its misleading influence upon those philosophers who have tried to imitate mathematical thought. And though he sometimes uses metaphysic narrowly to designate the critical examination of pure reason itself, he also says that, quote, this name of metaphysic may be given to the whole of pure philosophy, excluding all that belongs to the empirical and mathematical employment of reason, considering that it has only two objects, nature and freedom, that which is and that which ought to be. Kant divides philosophy into the speculative and the practical use of pure reason, which gives rise to a metaphysic of nature and a metaphysic of morals. Metaphysic, therefore, that of nature as well as that of morals, and particularly the criticism of our adventurous reason, which forms the introduction to and preparation for it, constitute together. Kant writes what may be termed philosophy in the true sense of the word. Its only goal is wisdom, and the path to it, science. Kant's innovations in vocabulary plainly announce the separation of philosophy from mathematics and experimental science, which is only imitated by earlier modern writers. But Kant still uses the word science for both the philosophical and the empirical sciences. The final step is taken in the 19th century when the word science is restricted to mathematics and to such knowledge of nature, man, and society as can be obtained by the methods of experimental or empirical research. William James, for example, stresses the fact that he is trying to expound psychology as one of the natural sciences, and to that end he tries to separate the problems which are capable of empirical investigation from those which belong to philosophical speculation. For Freud, That separation is an accomplished fact, and one which leaves to philosophy no problem that can be solved by science. According to Freud, it is inadmissible to declare that science is one field of human intellectual activity, and that religion and philosophy are others, at least as valuable, and that science has no business to interfere with the other two. On the contrary, Freud thinks it is right for scientific research to look, quote, on the whole field of human activity as its own. And to criticize the unscientific formulations of philosophy. The trouble with philosophy is that, quote, it behaves itself as if it were a science, but it parts company with science in that it clings to the illusion that it can produce a complete and coherent picture of the universe. It is this illusion which science continuously punctures, since, in Freud's opinion, that picture must needs fall to pieces with every new advance in our knowledge. Yeah, I wanted to try to check real quick. The tracking on my books to see if they weren't processed yet. A little bit concerned that maybe there's an issue here. Because I look at the shipment updates, and it's been at the same one since Monday. And it didn't change all week. It's still en route to DHL e-commerce or awaiting processing in Melrose Park, Illinois. So I don't know if I'm ever going to get that. It's probably just $140 wasted. But I bought it from this major bookstore called Half Price Books. They have like over 100 locations around the United States. Big bookstore. Maybe it'll just show up at my door today. That'd be cool. Fun little surprise. When science and philosophy are set apart, at last, it is possible to make sense of the typically modern questions concerning philosophy. How does it stand in relation to science? Does it consist of verifiable knowledge compared to that which can be obtained in the natural and social sciences? If not, what is the standard of truth in a philosophy? Does it consist of definitions and postulates leading to rigorously demonstrated conclusions in a manner comparable to mathematics, especially in its modern construction? If not, must it not be regarded as opinion or speculation rather than as knowledge in any strict sense? Or if philosophical thought can be compared with mathematics, does not the diversity of definitions and postulates employed by different philosophers reduce philosophy to a collection of competing systems rather than a single discipline in which philosophers work cooperatively, as do scientists and mathematicians? Hmm. Yeah, seems to me like a lot of the postulates that sort of build upon themselves in philosophy are more debatable than something like mathematics or science. Math is pretty concrete. Can't really argue that there's more than, you know, there's more one thing than another if it's sitting right there in front of you. However, the uh, don't forget where it was. When science and philosophy are set apart at last, it is possible to make sense of the typically modern questions concerning philosophy. How does it stand in relation to science? Does it consist of verifiable knowledge comparable to that which can be obtained in the natural and social sciences? If not, what is the standard of truth to philosophy? In philosophy, does it consist of definitions and postulates leading to rigorously demonstrated conclusions in a manner comparable to mathematics, especially in its modern construction? If not, must it not be regarded as opinion or speculation rather than as knowledge in any strict sense? Or if philosophical thought can be compared with mathematics, does not the diversity of definitions and postulates employed by different philosophers reduce philosophy to a collection of competing systems rather than a single discipline in which philosophers work cooperatively, as do scientists and mathematicians? However the foregoing questions are answered, there are still others. Does philosophy have distinct branches, divided according to their objects of study like the natural sciences? Or is philosophy to be identified with metaphysics? If in addition to metaphysics there is a philosophy of nature, how are its principles and conclusions related to the findings of the natural sciences, which appear to study the same objects? Similarly, if psychology is a branch of philosophy, how is it related to experimental or clinical psychology? What is the relation of moral and political philosophy to the empirical social sciences, concerned with describing, not judging or regulating human conduct and social institutions. Is economics a science, or is it a branch of moral philosophy? Or if it is both, how are the two related? What is the use of philosophy, especially in its theoretic branches, if, unlike science, it cannot be applied to the mastery of physical nature and the production of utilities, whether bridges or bombs? What finally, at the end of its long history, does philosophy come to if, in such marked contrast to the continuously accelerated progress of the sciences, it cannot claim any signal advance on which all philosophers are agreed, but instead must admit that most of its problems seem to be perennially debated, now as in every preceding century. Some of these questions, as well as certain answers to them, are considered in other chapters. The comparison of empirical research and philosophical thought as constituting different types of science. In the chapter on science, the distinction in relation between natural philosophy and natural science. In the chapter on physics, the difference between philosophical and scientific psychology. In the chapter on man, the function of definitions, hypotheses, postulates, or axioms, and the foundation and method of philosophy and science. In the chapter on principle, the difference between the practical use of philosophy in the spheres of morals and the use of science in the sphere of the productive arts. In the chapter on knowledge, the accumulation of truth as measuring advances in science and philosophy. In the chapter on progress, here we must observe that such answers to these questions as tend to subordinate philosophy to science originate exclusively with modern views of the nature of knowledge, of the criteria of truth, and of the capacities of the human mind, especially the power of reason. Even those modern authors who write at a time when the words science and philosophy are for the most part interchangeable tend in this direction. The points they make about the nature, aim, and method of what they call either science or philosophy have the effect of giving the status of knowledge only to mathematics and the empirical sciences, and of reducing philosophical speculation to the status of opinion. Bacon's insistence, for example, that genuine knowledge gives us power over nature and generates productions seems to have this effect, certainly upon any part of traditional philosophy which cannot meet this test. Hume's insistence upon experimental reasoning with respect to all matters of fact seems to eliminate not only metaphysics, but any science or philosophy of nature which is not experimental. The methodological reforms in philosophy which these philosophers and others like Hobbes, Descartes, and Spinoza propose seem to be reforms which eliminate whatever in philosophy cannot become either experimental science or a quasi-mathematical system of thought. Among the modern reformers of philosophy, Kant represents the exception. By his critical method, he hopes to establish philosophy above and independent of all the empirical sciences. and to institute metaphysics as a science which neither imitates mathematics nor accepts it as an equal in the scale of reason's accomplishments. Yet even Kant seems to betray the typically modern attitude toward philosophy. The intellectual revolution which he projects as the philosophical parallel to the Copernican revolution in astronomy is motivated by his desire to secure for philosophy a stability and development comparable to that enjoyed by mathematics and the empirical sciences. I think if philosophy is sort of waned as a science in popularity and esteem, probably because people have relied less on philosophers for peace of mind and more on material things, which science procures. Whereas philosophy is more of a social type of thing. You sort of get the wisdom of philosophy from other men. Whereas sciences can be distilled into schematics and formulas and recipes for creating things. In the progress of society, writes Adam Smith, philosophy or speculation becomes, like every other employment, the principal or sole trade and occupation of a particular class of citizens. Like every other employment, too, it is subdivided into a great number of different branches, each of which affords occupation to a peculiar tribe or class of philosophers. And this subdivision of employment in philosophy, as well as in every other business, improves dexterity and saves time. Each individual becomes more expert in his own peculiar branch. More work is done upon the whole, and the quantity of science is considerably increased by it. Despite his use of the word philosophy, it seems likely that Adam Smith is describing the division of labor in scientific research and the speculation of scientists. Though philosophy has divisions, and though the distinction and order of its parts are discussed by the great philosophers, their own work exhibits a spirit opposed to specialization. In fact, one measure of the greatness of a philosopher is the comprehensiveness of his thought, the range of subject matters, and the scope of the problems with which he deals. Those philosophers like Aristotle, Bacon, Hobbes, or Kant, who show great interest in the divisions of philosophy, seem to be largely concerned with distinguishing the different objects of philosophical thought and differentiating the concepts or principles peculiarly relevant to each. Other chapters deal with subject matters, sciences, and disciplines that have been regarded by one philosopher or another as major divisions of philosophy, e.g., logic, metaphysics, theology, dialectic, mathematics, physics, and psychology, in the chapter on man. But one group of sciences or disciplines is not discussed elsewhere and must be briefly noted here. Traditionally, within the province of the philosopher, they are sometimes expanded to this whole domain. They come nearer to what the ordinary man means by philosophy when he speaks of having a philosophy of life, an overall yet personal view of the human situation, illuminated by a sense of the values which should direct conduct. The disciplines in question are traditionally called ethics and politics, or moral philosophy. Socrates is credited with having accomplished the first great reform in philosophy when he turned to such subjects and away from the inquiries of his predecessors. I do not mean to speak disparagingly of the students of natural philosophy, he says at his trial. But the simple truth is, O Athenians, that I have nothing to do with physical speculations. Subsequently, he tells his judges that he, quote, will never cease from the practice and teaching of philosophy, reproaching those whom he questions with, quote, undervaluing the greater and overvaluing the less, enjoining them not to take thought of their persons or their properties, quote, but first and chiefly to care about the greatest improvement of the soul. He will not forswear for philosophy even to save his life. I cannot hold my tongue, he says. Daily discourse about virtue is the greatest good of man, for the unexamined life is not worth living. The conception of ethics and politics and of their relation to other branches of philosophy seem to depend upon the acceptance or rejection of a fundamental principle in the division of philosophy. Aristotle and Kant, for example, divide the philosophical sciences into the theoretic or speculative and the practical or moral, according as they consider what is the nature and causes of things, or what ought to be. The objects of choice, the ends and means in the conduct of life, and the institutions of society. According to this conception of the according to this conception of the practical sciences are ethics and politics, and with them economics and jurisprudence. Or in another statement of the same divisions, the parts of practical philosophy are moral philosophy of law. The parts of practical philosophy are moral philosophy, the philosophy of right, the philosophy of law. They are all conceived as normative, prescriptive, or regulative disciplines, determining what is good and evil, or right and wrong, and directing action in the sphere of human freedom. Hobbes proceeds on a different principle. He separates natural philosophy, including philosophia prima, from civil philosophy, or the theory of the body politic, but he includes ethics and poetics under natural philosophy as part of the theoretic study of human nature. The distinction between the rhetoric and the practical seem to be here ignored, or even implicitly denied insofar as Hobbes would reject the basis of the distinction, the difference between natural necessity and human freedom. Necessity governs the motions of the human body and of the body politic as much as it does the bodies studied by the physicists. And so ethics, politics, and physics are like sciences of determined consequences. Still another view seems to be taken by Bacon, who separates natural from human and civil philosophy, and divides natural philosophy into two main speculative branches, physics and metaphysics, and two main practical branches, mechanics and magic. Psychology, logic, and ethics belong to human philosophy, politics and jurisprudence to civil philosophy. But with respect to all of these, Bacon does not apply the distinction between the speculative and the practical, which seem to him the utmost importance in natural philosophy. Of the utmost importance in natural philosophy. The reason seems to be that Bacon uses the word practical to mean the production of effects resulting from the knowledge of causes rather than actions to be performed by men as the result of choice. His practical sciences correspond, therefore, to what Aristotle conceives as arts or productive sciences, the sphere of making or poetics in general. Not to what Aristotle means by the practical, the sphere of doing rather than of making, or the sphere of doing rather than of making, of prudence rather than of art. These matters are discussed in the chapters on art and poetry. The problem of the relation of science to art becomes, if restated in Bacon's terms, the problem of relation of the theoretic to the practical, i.e., productive sciences. But in terms of Aristotle, Aquinas, or Kant, the problem of the relation between the speculative and practical branches of philosophy becomes the quite different problem of how knowledge of being or nature relates to knowledge of what should be sought or ought to be done. In Hobbes's terms, the problem shifts in still another direction to the consideration of the bearing of physics upon psychology, ethics, and politics. How, on any of the foregoing views, do speculations concerning the nature of things affect the theory of human life and society, or the practical principles by which man tries to lead a good life and organize a good society? What relation do the truths of physics and metaphysics, or the major philosophical issues in these fields, bear on the truths and issues in psychology, ethics, and politics? Or, as William James puts the question, must not any man who has a philosophy of life also have, implicitly at least, a metaphysics? Upon the answers to such questions depends the varying esteem in which philosophy is held in the great periods of Western culture. Unlike supernatural religion and empirical science, and especially when separated from them, philosophy does not promise eternal salvation or earthly prosperity. The uses of philosophy, as compared with religion and science, must somehow be assessed in terms which, from the beginning of philosophy, are of its essence, the love of wisdom, and through it the search for human wisdom, which shall be at once speculative and practical. Very cool. Socrates. Socrates. Which I believe we have here. Great dialogues of Plato. That's where Socrates is contained mostly, I think, because Plato was a student of Socrates, and Plato was also someone who did a lot of writing. He wrote this stuff down, whereas Socrates did not write anything down. And Aristotle was a student of Plato. Born in Athens. I want to see where they talk about Socrates in here. Here we go. So far, we have seen that Athens' political experiences at the end of the 5th century resulted in defeat and disillusionment. Similarly, intellectual developments had also reached an impasse. The theories of the natural philosophers were abstract and of little relevance. The sophists, who focused on practical matters affecting human beings, failed to advance knowledge and sometimes even distorted the truth. It is at this point that Socrates appears on the scene and suggests a way out of these quandaries. Born in Athens in 469 BCE, he did not participate actively in politics, though he was once chosen by lot to serve on the council, and he fought in several battles of the Peloponnesian War. We don't know how he supported himself, but he seems to have spent most of his time conversing with people whose opinions he exposed as unfounded. I think he sold like mediocre sculptures. He attracted a following, especially among the city's youth, who delighted to see pretension punctured. But in doing this, Socrates also irritated many other people, a fact to which Plato refers when he compares Socrates to a gadfly or a stingray. The earliest representation of Socrates is in Aristophanes' comedy The Clouds. He is depicted there as the master of a school, the Think Shop, where he hangs from a basket looking upward at the skies, and where he teaches young men to be disputatious for a fee. This portrayal caricatures Socrates as both a natural philosopher and a sophist. Interestingly, the charges that were brought against Socrates almost a quarter of a century later, that he was impious and corrupted the young, have much in common with this earlier, albeit parodic, portrayal. The Apology, which is Plato's version of the speeches Socrates gave in his own defense, even refers to Aristophanes' play. But here in the Apology, Socrates denies that he was ever a natural philosopher, and while he elsewhere, Phaedo, admits to a youthful infatuation with the subject, he says that he abandoned it because its exponents explained the world as the product of chance or necessity rather than as the work of a purposeful and intelligent designer. Similarly, while Socrates resembled the sophists in that youths gathered around him to hear his conversations, they did so voluntarily and never paid a fee. More important, more important, the lessons they learned from him were very different from those the sophists taught, not how to speak, but how to think. How then did Socrates get in trouble? In the Apology, Plato has the philosopher tell how his old friend Chaerephon had once asked the Delphic oracle if anyone was wiser than Socrates. When the answer came back that no such person existed, Socrates was perplexed and set out to refute the oracle by interrogating politicians, poets, and craftsmen, all of whom claimed to be wise. The examination, however, only exposed their ignorance and earned Socrates their displeasure. He was forced to conclude that the oracle was right. He was wise in at least this one respect, namely that he did not think he knew what he did not really know. Many of Plato's dialogues depict Socrates conducting just this sort of examination. In them, Socrates' primary interest is ethical, not how to be successful in the world's terms, as the sophists taught, but how to live a good life. Since he equated virtue with knowledge, he believed that no one would knowingly do wrong. It was of paramount importance to him that individuals should act on the basis not of opinion, correct or otherwise, but of true knowledge. Socrates' method for arriving at this was dialectic, a type of conversation in which he would subject someone to a cross-examination, eristic, designed with a specific end in mind, the testing or refutation, elenchus, of a proposition that that person had advanced. Asking for a precise definition of the moral virtues under discussion, what is justice or piety or courage, he would engage his companion in a series of questions intended to uncover logical impossibilities or inconsistencies with the original thesis. Not surprisingly, this would often have the effect of reducing his interlocutor to a state of perplexity, aporia. This was essentially a negative result, showing what justice or piety or courage was not. But to be at a loss to know what one does not know is not an end in itself, but a precondition for discovery. As Socrates famously put it, the unexamined life is not worth living. We cannot know for certain how much of this characterization in the dialogues reflects the historical Socrates and how much is Plato's creation. Similarly, we cannot know precisely where Socrates' ideas leave off and Plato's begin. But in a sense, it is not really necessary to disentangle the two, unless one is trying to divine the original Socrates or to reconstruct the development of Plato's thought. Of course, scholars who have, over the years, tried to do just this, and have even grouped the dialogues into early, middle, and late works. There have always been disagreement, however, about where to place certain dialogues within this scheme. And recently, some scholars are even questioning the stylometric evidence upon which the traditional classification has been based and the chronological conclusions that have been drawn from it. For our purposes, the dialogues fall into three broad categories that are based on certain topical and formal characteristics and what do not necessarily equate to early, middle, and late periods. The largest and most varied group includes works of varying lengths that focus on ethical questions and feature Socrates as their leading character. In some of these, he uses the aggressive elenctic method of examination described above, and that subset consists of the dialogues that end in aporia rather than in any positive discovery. Then there is a group of longer dialogues. The conversation within them is often set with a narrative frame, and while Socrates is still the main figure, elenctic questioning is replaced by more sustained argumentation, which produces positive results. Many scholars have assumed, not unreasonably, that these dialogues introduce Plato's own fully developed ideas, most notably the theory of the forms. Finally, there are a few longer works that are very different from those in the other two groups. Here, Socrates is not the main character. The style is less dramatic and more expository. Subject matter is more technical, e.g., cosmology, epistemology, metaphysics, and the treatment seems addressed to a more professional audience, since Plato overtly engages with the ideas of others. The present volume contains major dialogues that are representative of the first group, Ion, Apology, Crito, and the second group, Meno, Phaedo, Symposium, and Republic. Among Plato's most famous works, these are the most accessible ones and provide the best introduction to the Socratic method, to Plato's artistry, and to some of the most important ideas. The short introductions and footnotes for each translation in this volume provide further summary and helpful commentary, but the dialogues should also be allowed to speak for themselves, and the reader should feel free to follow where they lead, like the bird catchers in the anecdote about Plato's dream that appears at the top of this introduction. Is that Plato? Statue of him? Complete texts of the Republic, the Apology, Crito, Phaedo, Ion, Meno, Symposium. It's funny because this entire thing is just the Republic. But you're telling me okay, there's a ton of endnotes, and there's a lengthy introduction. So that whole thing is the Republic. Or just Republic. They're saying that Republic, the Republic, they call it the Republic in this one. Okay, so it's most of this book, I think. You know. That's, yeah. The Republic is most of it. I'll talk about. I was just kind of curious what percentage of Plato's dialogues, I guess, was just him talking to Socrates. Maybe Socrates talking to somebody else. Okay. Philosophy is part Idealist 2. Philosophy. Strike through text generator. By formatting. Boom. Cross it off the list. I'm getting a major introduction to I don't even know if you could sum it up as philosophy now. The great conversation about everything. I guess I should update my stream titles. I think you can call it all philosophy, and it's broad enough for me.